morning, everyone. Welcome to the June 2025 installment of the Idaho Department of Labor Market Insight Series, Part 2 of the 2025 Idaho Rural Profile. My name is Will Henneke. I am the Public Information Officer here at the Idaho Department of Labor, and I am your host today. This presentation is being recorded. We will send out a link of the recording to those of you who have registered for the event. On our YouTube channel, you can go find previous Labor Economist Insight webinar recordings along with other business webinars from the Idaho Department of Labor. Now, we welcome any questions that you may have over the course of the next hour. Please press the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom panel to submit your question, and the question will be answered at the end of the presentation by the panelists. Today, labor economists Sam Wolkenhauer, Lisa Grigg, and Brandon Duong will talk to you about the second part of the Rural Profile report regarding economics. The first part of the report focused on demographics, and that recording of that particular webinar is available on Labor's YouTube channel to watch at your convenience in case you are interested. Up first is Lisa Grigg to introduce this chapter and the subject matter that the economists will be discussing. Lisa?
Thanks, Will, and thank you for joining us, everyone on the webinar. So here's kind of a quick look of the rural profile. So we have designated 2025 as the year of rural in Idaho, and what that means is that we are doing a deep dive over each quarter of the year to kind of look at what sets rural Idaho apart from its urban components, but also how it's changed since the last rural profile of 2005. So you can see here that this is the second of 4 series. The first one, demographics, as Will said, you can see the previous webinar on the Idaho Department of Labor YouTube channel. You can also see the publication that's been published on the website Idaho at Work as well. So, and these will continue to be published throughout the year, but right now we're on section 2. We're going to be covering employment, agriculture, changing work, housing, recreation, and tourism. So go ahead and go next slide, please. And here again, just to repeat, we have Brandon Duong, who's the labor economist for Southeastern Idaho. Myself, Lisa Grigg, I'm the labor economist in North Central, and Sam Wolkenhauer is the labor economist in Northern Idaho. Next slide, please. Okay, so to start this off, we're going to start with a trivia question. And the trivia question is going to be, which just popped up on your screen, which industry leads rural Idaho with the highest job count? And your answer there, you can choose, you have 4 choices: education, retail, mining, and manufacturing. And while you're kind of thinking about that, I'm just going to redefine a little bit of how we classify urban versus rural. So any urban county in Idaho, there's 9 of them, is a county with at least a principal city of more than 20,000 people. And so any other counties, there's 35 rural counties and 9 urban counties. And so just a quick reminder there that it's not based on total county population, it's based on the principal city population. So if hopefully we can kind of wrap this up and get some answers pretty soon. Okay, so according to this, half of you actually thought it was manufacturing. And so you are correct. But I did want to say nobody chose mining, which I think is interesting because when Idaho became a state in 1890, mining was the top employment industry. Things have changed a lot in 130 years. But I think it's also interesting that no one did choose it. It's now a very small part of Idaho employment. But most any mining that is done in the rural areas. So here we go looking at this. So if you look at the far left here, so quickly to define goods producing and service providing. Goods producing includes the industries of agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, mining, construction, and manufacturing. So you pretty much create a physical good within these industries. Service providing is all others. These are things like architects and doctors and bankers and teachers, where mostly the job, what they provide is a service. So the big point here is that manufacturing is the top industry for rural employment in Idaho. This is different than what we see when we go across the screen here to urban and Idaho, which both have healthcare as their top industry. And yes, healthcare is number 2 in rural. It's a significant component. It's also one of our fastest growing industries and will continue to be. But it is important to notice, though, that manufacturing is the top dog here in rural. And even when you go beyond the top 4, the number 5 in rural is agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. Construction, I think, is number 7, right behind education. So you have a lot of goods producing kind of weighted towards the front end of your rural area. So go ahead and go to the next slide. But when we talk about rural Idaho, it is not homogeneous at all. Every region has its own specialties and distinct industries that happen there. So we're just going to kind of highlight a couple of them here. What I want to mention first is that if you look across all 6 regions, you will see that retail shows up in the top 4 of all 6 of them. This is the only industry actually to see that. But you also see healthcare and manufacturing each show up in 5 of the 6 industries as well. So pretty common industries there. Northern and Southwestern are the only 2 regions that have the exact same top 4 industries, but every single one of them is in a different order. And so even though they are the same 4, the presence of them, for instance, Northern is retail for top 1, Southwestern is healthcare. And so just wanted to point that out. We're going to kind of take a little trip around the state here for the other regions. So North Central, if you look, actually is the only region that has public administration that shows up in the top 4. And some interesting things about that are that the Nez Perce tribe is a significant employer in this region. It is also home to lots of state employees are actually located here as well. There's lots of state offices. It's home to 2 of the 10 Idaho prisons in these rural counties here, as well as one of the 4 psychiatric hospitals. The other big thing about North Central with public administration is a lot of its land in Clearwater and Idaho County is federally managed with the BLM and the Forest Service. We also have Army Corps of Engineers. So there's also some federal government employment that sits in there that's kind of special to this area too. If we go to South Central is the only region that has agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting even show up in the top 4, and it's number 1. This region, of course, is home to what we think of as like the mecca of food processing. It has about half of the state's 2.5 million cows in this region. And in some rural counties of South Central, there's 8 cows for every person that reside in the county. It also does a lot of trout farming, sugar beets, potatoes. You can see that manufacturing is the number 2 industry here. These are highly correlated. So these are, growing the crops, raising the cows, and then processing close by. And Brandon will talk to you more about agriculture when we get there, but South Central is a very stronghold, along with Southeastern. Here, manufacturing is, again, kind of the continuing some of that same agri-processing. But the interesting thing about Southeastern here is education. It's the only rural region of Idaho where education shows up in the top 4. And it's actually, Oneida County is the home of Idaho's largest virtual K through 12 school. And so you have some more employment that shows up there than you normally would. And then when we move quickly to Southeastern, again, you have an industry we've not seen before in any of the 5 other labor regions, and this is professional, scientific, and technical services. And again, this is number 1. This is highly influenced by the Idaho National Laboratory in the rural areas of Region 6. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so quickly, again, just a really, really quick overview. What this slide is showing you is that in 2003, 26% of statewide employment was within rural counties. That has now decreased to 23%. And what that means is that employment share has shifted. So it's more highly concentrated in the 9 urban counties. But we also saw that with population. Population shifted in the last 20 years as well. It went from, actually had a 4% higher concentration going towards the urban counties. So some of this is kind of a natural flow of how the population moved. But also when you break it up to goods producing and service providing, goods producing actually held fairly steady in the rural region. You can actually see that the rural regions have a higher share than their total share of employment when you look at goods producing, and a lower share of total employment when you go to service providing. Okay, next slide, please. So this again is a similar idea, but it's broken down by the 4 county types. So there's urban, and then there's 3 different rural county types that we've identified. Commuting county types, which are in kind of the brown, have at least 25% of their workforce commute to a nearby metropolitan county. They're highly dependent on that county, but they're still considered rural. Rural centers have at least 7,500 residents in a principal city. So they don't quite meet the requirements for 20,000 residents to be urban, but they do have definitely a center within that county. And then the open country makes up the rest. About half of Idaho's counties are open country. There's 22 of them. And again, they don't meet any of the requirements, and so they get put into the open country. But what I want to show you here is that you can see that urban really gained in whether we look at total goods producing or service providing. But commuting counties also gained in goods producing employment as well. So even though it looks like rural or urban gained everywhere, if you start looking and breaking it down into its components, you can actually see that commuting had the fastest concentration. It gained the most. It gained a little bit higher than urban. Whereas in service providing, all three county types lost share to the urban counties. Okay, go ahead. So this slide is just looking at goods producing employment. And again, goods producing, just to repeat, kind of looks at agriculture, forestry, fishing, and mining, construction, and manufacturing. And so the map here on the left is showing you the concentration of counties that have differing levels of goods producing employment as a share of their total employment per county. So those that are the highest are in the dark blue, and you can see that besides the very northern tip of Idaho and Boundary County, you can see that a lot of it is the very southern belt of Idaho, specifically mostly in south central and southeastern Idaho. There is no urban county that has over 30% of its employment in goods producing industries, but there are 12 rural counties that do. And so I think it's important to note that the U's, I'll tell you where the urban counties are located, by the way, just kind of as a pinpoint there. But all the highest goods producing employment is in the rural counties. And rural counties are really vital to Idaho. They account for about 88% of the land area. They contribute about 25% of GDP, but they contribute over half of the state's GDP in utilities and natural resources. You can actually see here that 2 out of every 3 natural resource jobs are in rural counties. And then they actually, when we look at manufacturing, they contribute about 40% of non-durable manufacturing as well. And manufacturing is interesting for rural because it actually grew faster in the rural areas in the last 20 years than it did urban. The growth rates for rural counties were 1.3%, double the 0.6% we saw for rural. And manufacturing's concentration in rural counties, actually increased. It was 26% in 2003 as a share of total manufacturing jobs statewide. It's now 29%. Construction actually went the other way. The fastest growth in construction was in urban counties. And construction actually was 26% of construction jobs were in rural counties as well in 2003. That's actually decreased to 23%. So when you break up goods producing, you have aspects and industries that are actually moving in different directions. So manufacturing continues to favor rural, while construction is favoring urban. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just looking at service providing very quickly. So again, we've got kind of that total there, kind of as a reminder. Urban went up, all three rural county types look to decrease. Education, health, strong, and trade, transportation, utilities both went strongly toward urban, but professional business services went the complete opposite direction. And as you can see, actually declined, and not only just the open country counties increased, but all rural counties actually increased their concentration of total jobs here. The other industry that we actually saw increase was information. Information actually saw a higher concentration in rural counties as well, but the difference was information jobs actually declined from what they were 20 years ago, while professional and business services have increased significantly. And so very different trends there, but most of the reason why information increased in rural was it just declined less in the rural areas than it did in the urban areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so quickly changing to wages. This graph is 2003, and it's looking at those job earners averaging more than $640 a week, and that will translate to $16 an hour for a 40-hour week. This was 20 years ago. And so kind of the way to read this is if you look down the columns, the green will tell you the highest labor region, the red will tell you the lowest, and then if there's little dashes, it means that that region does not have one of those types. For instance, there's no commuting counties in the northern region of Idaho. But looking quickly at this on the top line, Idaho statewide, you can see that about 35% of workers were making over $640 a week. This is earnings. This is not based on stocks or anything. This is job earnings. And urban was quite a bit higher than rural, with 37% of urban versus 28% of rural employees making this level. You can see there is a couple of regions where there was a higher percentage of rural workers making more than the urban workers. And one of those is the northern region, barely, just by a smidge. You can see 33% versus 32%. And then South Central was 30% versus 28%. But then if we go to the next slide, this is now 2023. And this is $1,080 a week, which is the equivalent of $27 an hour for a 40-hour week. This is very close to being inflation adjusted. So this is what $16 an hour would be worth now in 2023, is equivalent to about $27 an hour. It's actually really different. And I think that's fascinating. If you look at the top line again, 40% of workers are now earning over this level. And it's really, really similar between urban and rural. Rural no longer leads the urban areas. The urban has really shot up, kind of leaving rural behind. But the big change has happened if you look in South Central, Southeastern, and Eastern. All three of these regions, actually, there's a higher portion of rural workers who make this level or above than there are urban workers. Eastern, of course, is a significant outlier. Again, as mentioned, INL is a big employer in that area. But I think it's also just interesting when you look at, we've talked about South Central and Southeastern kind of being heavy in food processing and things, but their trends really changed from what it was 20 years ago. So just kind of fascinating to see. There was big divides though too. Southwestern, 45% urban versus only 30% of rural. So there's no region, like I said, is homogeneous. But before I pass it off, I just want to say that again, rural Idaho is incredibly vital. It makes up over 90% of both national forest acreage and state endowment land acreage. Those are used for both industry and recreation throughout Idaho. And it's also home to more than 75% of Idaho's farm acreage as well. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Brandon Duong to discuss agriculture.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, no, I think one of the main things people think about when they think Idaho is agriculture. We're very known for our potatoes worldwide, and let's get a little bit into that in this section. So as far as what we make here in Idaho, we're home to more than 185 agricultural commodities. We're the top producer of several of those commodities, including potatoes, barley, peppermint, and we just have a lot of land resources tied up in agriculture. And a lot of that is in rural counties. Our top 4 counties for land acreage for agricultural production are all rural counties. That includes Bingham County at number 1, which is 897,000 acres, followed by Owyhee, Cassia. And then at our 5th spot, I think Lisa spoiled it a little bit, but Twin Falls, which is an urban county, is number 5 at 459,000 acres. Something that is not really unique to ag is the century of change that we've been experiencing, I guess. And there's been a lot of change in ag. Some of it, is it good or bad? It's just change, right? And we're going to be talking a little bit about that in our next slide, please. So just getting into acreage, if we take a look at all of our regions, all of our region types, we have urban, commuting, rural center, and open country. In a lot of those, we do see some acreage reduction. We see some urban decline and open country decline, some small increases in commuting and rural center, but overall, we had a total acreage loss of 219,000 acres of farmland from 2002 to 2022. And a lot of this is driven by our urban counties. We lost about 180,000 acres in urban counties just because land use is very competitive in those urban counties. When you're a landholder and you're looking at urban opportunities, you have a lot more people looking to do industrial parks, industrial warehousing, business parks, or even just housing. A lot of those can end up being very profitable, and that has resulted in a little bit of a balancing act between our farmland and our land for other types of industries. But yeah, that acreage loss amounted to about a 1.9% decline. So if we take a look in this next slide on farms, the number of farms too has also decreased from 2002 to 2022. We had about 23,000 farms lost in that period, which is about 8.6% decline. And, oh, not 23,000 lost, sorry. We have 23,000 in 2022, we lost 2,100. And if we look at our different county types, it's pretty universal here. Urban, commuting, rural center, open country, all lost farms in those 2 decades, right? We do see a little bit of consolidation going on maybe. We have average farm size increasing by 35 acres to 505 on average, which is about a 7.4% increase in average farm size. But what else has been the result of this, right? If we're seeing all this land use going to other resources, we see the number of farms decreasing. Are we experiencing a big decline in production? The answer is no, certainly not. Our farm revenue has increased by 179%. And if we take a look at different inflation-adjusted measures like farm-related income, that's going to be revenue minus expenses, that increased by 131% from 2002 to 2022. And yeah, just taking a look at that 2022 breakdown of farm revenue, Lisa spoiled it again a little bit for what is going on as far as revenue goes. We have revenue that's dominated by cattle and milk production at 6 billion. Potatoes are in there, they're third place at 1 billion, but cattle and milk has really been something of a more recent development. So back in the early 2000s, we had a lot of milk and beef production taking place in California. But as sort of the regulatory environments changed, Idaho looked like a really favorable environment to do those business startups. And if we look at that chart to the right, we can really see the effect of that. If we look at the revenue that's attributable to rural livestock versus rural crops, in 2002, they're pretty close. They're 1 billion to 1.5 billion in revenue. But moving past that, there's a big divergence that takes place until by 2022, we have 4.5 billion in livestock. You know, that includes our cows, our milk, and we have about 3 billion in crops. And that's really driven by our rural counties. If we'd like take a look at our urban livestock versus crops, there's maybe not as big of a divergence there. They've been pretty much neck and neck. And where did all this milk and beef production go? Well, it all went to South Central mostly. If we take a look at our county rankings for farm revenue, we have number 1 is Cassia, 2 is Twin, 3rd is Gooding, and 4th is Jerome. What do they all have in common? They're all in South Central, and they're all producing 1 billion or close to 1 billion in revenue. And if we take note too, Twin Falls is an urban county, right? So what's going on in ag is we have a little bit less of urban-rural divide, and we have a little bit more of a, is it South Central or is it not South Central Idaho divide? Because South Central is, as Lisa said, the mecca of ag, basically. It's just such a favorable environment to do all sorts of ag. And, you know, with this revenue growth, we have to ask, what's the source? If we're losing all these farms, we're losing all this acreage. Well, it's been technology improvements. We have drones now to assess water levels. That's a pretty new development. No-till soil techniques. We've got a lot of new automated farming implements. We have amazing harvesters these days. We have harvesters that have GPS, they have real-time yield data, and they have all the sensors to support that sort of data-driven framework. Additionally, other labor-saving technology, we have stuff that can sort crops right in the field. If your potatoes are too small, it'll drop those back into the field. Just amazing, amazing developments. And if we go to our next slide, we can see all county types, urban and rural, had pretty substantial increases in farm revenue. Urban, we went from about 1 billion to close to 3 billion in 2002 to 2022. And that's the region that had the most loss in farm acreage and farm number. So those are becoming a lot more efficient. Commuting is kind of a similar story. Just across the board, we've had a pretty big increase in farm revenue. And if we go to our next slide, we will find gross domestic product, another inflation adjusted measure, has really been a really great story. So all the way back in 2002, our ag GDP was at about 2,000, and our non-durable GDP, that includes a lot of food manufacturing, was at 1,600, and those really followed neck and neck this century up until 2021, when ag GDP just got a massive boost to 4,909. And that has a lot to do with emergency grants during the COVID era flowing through the industry. But it's just been a real story of growth. As far as what percentage of GDP, ag is about 5.3% for overall state GDP, and food processing is about 4.4%. So it's they're major sectors of our economy. And like I said at the beginning of this, when we're talking about ag, we're talking about a lot of change. Part of it is a story about acreage reduction and total number of farms being somewhat reduced in the 2002 to 2022 period. But it's also a story of major productive gains, huge efficiency gains, and increasing revenue, no matter how you slice it. Farm income, which is inflation adjusted, or just raw revenue. But if we go to our next slide and we get into our poll, something else that's changed a lot is our relationship with work. And that is something that came into the limelight, I think, during the pandemic era. So what I want to ask from the audience right now is, how much did statewide work from home increase between 2018 and 2023? And I'm giving you 4 options: 12%, 49%, 90%, or 135%. And real quick too, while we're getting those numbers in, I just want to thank the city of Clifton, Idaho for giving us permission to use this beautiful landscape. I think it really showcases the spirit of rural Idaho. Personally, if I was voting, I didn't know the answer, I would have picked 90%. So maybe that's a little bit of a spoiler. It's not 90. All right, most people say 49%. That's a pretty fair guess, but it was actually 135% increase in work from home statewide from that 2018 to 2023 period. So work from home, again, really came into the limelight around the COVID-19 pandemic, just because it enabled people to stay at work, keep their income, but also I guess the idea was to stop the spread of that virus. But it's really been around a lot longer than that. Ever since there's been dial-up computers, there's been people working from home. It's just now that we're seeing a big increase in numbers. If we look at the year 2000, we've got about 1/3 of our work from home in Idaho taking place in our rural counties, and about 2/3 in our urban counties. And that stayed pretty flat. There are some gains just because we've had a lot of infrastructure improvements around our broadband access. That's been a major improvement, but we didn't see a really big increase until that pandemic hit, when we see about 160% growth in urban counties and 67% growth in our rural counties, all amounting to that 135% from the poll. Now, just taking a look at this graph, right, you would get the impression that rural, barely changed at all compared to urban, and that's not really the case, I don't think. Relatively speaking, urban did have a lot of work from home growth, but just taking a look at the next slide, if we break it down, we do see a lot of change in the past few years as far as our telework is concerned. So we have about nearly 4,000 people added to our work from home workforce in open country counties between 2018 and 2023. And we have about 2,000 person increase in our rural center and commuting. Rural center and commuting are really neck and neck in this metric, but there's definitely an increase there occurring in our rural counties. And I think, you get the sense that a lot of these individuals are coming just because of, like I showcased in Clifton, the beauty of the landscape. And if you're going to be working from home, why not work from home in the most beautiful, serene place you can? And I think that's a story that is highlighted by just a number of people moving to these rural counties. But I would like to also say that I think there's a big sense in a lot of people when you talk to them about work from home and telework, that's substantially increased, and maybe past 2022. Oh, that's kind of a thing that just happened in the pandemic, and it's really gone down a lot since then. But our statewide data that we do have access to kind of tells a little bit of a different story. If we take a look at that statewide data, we find that there was an increase around a decrease around mid 2023 of about 200,000 work from home hours. This is measured in hours, by the way. But after that, we really kept a lot of the same gains of work from home hours pretty much into 2024. When we get to early 2025, there was an additional 300,000 drop since January. This is very initial data, and it's going to get a little bit more refined as we get further out. Maybe we'll have a better rural versus urban breakdown of this in the coming years, but mostly that was associated with executive order from the federal government. So really, work from home in rural and urban counties has been very strong in the past few years, and it has continued to do so basically up until very recent times. But with that, we're going to get into with Sam a little bit about not just work from home, but the homes themselves. So hand it off to Sam.
That was a nicely executed segue. We're going to kick off a little section about housing with one more trivia question. So we talk a lot about affordable housing. Of course, that almost becomes a buzzword. We understand the importance of affordable housing, but what does it actually mean, right? So the trivia question relates to what actually is affordable housing? What percentage of income can you spend on housing costs for your housing to still be considered affordable, right? And this has a regulatory definition, and it appears in all the data sets about housing. So we just want to gauge if people actually know what is affordable housing, because with how often that phrase gets bandied about, you could easily be forgiven for not quite knowing how to define it. We'll give that a second to run. And then I will click forward because I don't want to give away the answer with the beautiful slide that awaits us on the other side. Okay, so most people, it looks like, knew that affordable housing means that your housing costs don't exceed 30% of gross household income. And the majority of everybody else picked 33.3%, which is close, right? So we're talking roughly a third. 30% gross household income going to housing. That's our benchmark for affordable housing. And just to set the context for this, we understand that we have an issue with affordable housing, And that is absolutely borne out by the data. So if you look at the housing affordability tracker from the Atlanta Fed, which factors in home prices, mortgage rates, and real-time income series, what you see is that for pretty much all of that period from 2014 up through the middle of 2021, housing was generally affordable in the United States. It wobbles around a little bit, but in general, for most of that period, the median American household could buy the median American house, and the cost of that housing would be right around that affordability line, 30%. In 2022, however, these lines begin to diverge. And at this point, we're looking at a national housing market where for the median American household, right, so that's a household earning 50th percentile of income, if they were to purchase the median home today, it would be expected that about 45% of their gross income would go to their housing costs, which is obviously far in excess of the affordability metric. And the basic problem here is not too difficult to understand. Homes are still priced as if mortgage rates were at 3.5%. But of course, mortgage rates are no longer there. They're no longer anywhere close to there. So we still have homes hovering at these near all-time price highs. But the run-up in mortgage rates has created a real affordability crunch for households. And we want to understand what's going on with the housing stock and affordability in rural Idaho so we can get the flavor here. Now, if you live in an urban county in Idaho, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that we have built an absolute surplus of housing stock. There's building everywhere. In fact, we have a crunch of the housing stock in Idaho. So what I want to show you is that if you split up Idaho into these 4 county types that we've been talking about, in all 4 county types, the growth rate of the population has significantly outstripped the growth of the housing stock. Both of these numbers come from the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau publishes not only estimates of the population in these counties, they also publish the number of total housing units. So this lumps all single and multifamily housing forms into one. You get a total housing stock for every county. And what you see is that even in urban Idaho, where the housing stock grew by more than 20% over the last decade, it still didn't quite keep up with population growth. What we really want to emphasize here, though, is that population growth significantly outstripped the growth of the housing stock in our rural county types. And in fact, among Idaho's 44 counties, there was only 1 county where the number of housing units grew faster than the population over the last decade that we're measuring here. And that would be, surprise, surprise, Ada County, where there has been massive construction. And in Ada County, the growth rates were, within a percentage point of each other. So in Ada County, the housing stock has roughly kept up with the population. Everywhere else, population growth has outstripped the housing stock. And so if we break this down, kind of what it looks like is this. So you see 2 columns here marked housing density. Okay, well, what does that mean? That basically means how many people are there for every housing unit in the relevant geographic type. So for example, in 2023, there were 2.5 Idaho residents for every housing unit in the state. And you can see the change over time. And very clearly what you see is that the population growth in the state pretty significantly exceeded the growth of the housing stock. And so we represent that in the growth ratio, which is the rightmost column. So when we have a growth ratio of 1.4 for Idaho, what that means is the population grew 1.4 times the growth of the housing stock. And you can see that across all geographic types, the population grew quite a bit faster than the housing stock. What I want to draw your attention to, though, is the cell there in the bottom right-hand corner. In our open country, which again, remember, that's about half the counties in Idaho, the population grew about 5 times as fast as the housing stock. We had very little growth of the housing stock in these most rural counties, but the population grew pretty substantially, about 13% over that decade. Now, the reason this hasn't amounted to a catastrophic housing shortage has to do with your starting point, right? It's not only how fast you grow, it's where you're starting from. And what you notice is that in 2013, open country counties had significantly better housing density than the rest of the state. There were only 1.8 residents for every housing unit, compared to 2.6 in the urban counties. So the overall picture that we get is that in rural counties in Idaho, population growth significantly outstripped the growth of the housing stock. However, the worst effects of this were not felt because they were starting from a relatively favorable position. Okay, so even with this vastly disparate growth rate, the housing density issue is not as severe in rural Idaho as it is in our urban counties. And you see that very clearly in the housing density numbers for 2023. So in urban counties, we have 2.7 residents for every housing unit. It's only 2.3 for our rural counties, though that has increased significantly. The next thing I want to note, though, is that the composition of the housing stock looks different depending on what part of Idaho you're in. So if you break up the growth of the housing stock, what you see is that in urban counties and in rural counties, there's been a pretty significant shift towards multifamily construction. Okay, so if you start in the 2003 columns, which are on the left hand of each of these county types, you can see that multifamily made up a relatively small portion of the new housing stock in urban counties as well as in the rural types. Over the years since then, however, you illustrated with these sort of downward pointing arrows, you see that in urban and rural centers, the housing stock is shifting pretty significantly towards multifamily construction. You do not see a corresponding shift in our commuting and open country types. Now, that probably doesn't surprise you with respect to the open country counties. Remember, these are the most rural, generally the most thinly populated counties in the state. So it stands to reason that there's not going to be a lot of multifamily and apartment construction. I do think it's interesting, however, that the commuting counties remain predominantly single family. Remember, commuting counties are counties that are pretty closely tied to a nearby urban center. These are counties where more than a quarter of the workforce commutes to a nearby urban center. So, for example, we have a lot of these counties in the rural areas surrounding the Boise area. So these are rural counties that are nevertheless tied to nearby urban centers. And even in these county types, we're not seeing a shift towards multifamily construction. It's still almost exclusively single family. That shift is really only occurring in places that are either cities outright or are these rural centers. So an illustration of that in my region would be Sandpoint. Sandpoint's sort of the prototypical rural center where you have a pretty decent sized city in a rural environment. And if you drive to Sandpoint, you will certainly see that there has been a pretty strong shift towards multifamily there. We're not seeing it in the more rural counties, however. And so what this adds up to is a pretty strong crunch on rents in rural Idaho. So remember, we'll return to that definition of affordable housing, right? Affordable housing means 30% or less of your income is going to your housing costs. So if we look at the percentage of households that are cost burdened by extension means you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing. You can see that in most counties in Idaho back in 2003, less than a third or so of households were cost burdened. So what that means, essentially translating this into very plain English, is that across most of Idaho in 2003, the majority of renting households were not rent burdened, right? Rents were still relatively affordable in 2003 across most of the state. This also jives with what I showed you with the housing affordability tracker, that up until recently, housing was generally considered affordable. You fast forward to 2023, and basically what you have is a state that is being painted blue across the board, right? We now have very few counties where we have not seen this stark increase in rent burdening. And this is just associated with these overall trends that we're showing you, that construction of the housing stock has not kept pace with population growth. We do have fewer housing units per capita across essentially all of the state, Ada County being the lone exception. And this is clearly showing up in rent burdens on households. So that's our sort of high level picture of the housing stock situation. And again, this is not intended to be a teaser, but there's certainly going to be a more thorough exploration of this in the report that we'll be publishing soon. But hopefully this gives you a flavor for what we're seeing. Population growth in the rural counties of Idaho has been very strong. And even though we're seeing pretty good construction activity in many parts of the state, it's not keeping pace with the population growth. And that's putting upward pressure on rents and housing affordability, and households are certainly feeling that across most of the state as this map just steadily darkens as there's more and more pressure on rents. Lastly, we're going to end on a little bit of a light note, and then we will transition to a Q&A. You may be shocked to hear this, but the majority of the beautiful recreational opportunities in Idaho are located in our rural counties, which account for about 80% of the campsites and cabins across the state. I know that most Americans probably believe that their state is the most beautiful in this vast union of ours, but of course we know that only Idahoans are correct. And we're certainly seeing this in the rapid growth in lodging sales in rural Idaho. You see a very significant uptick really over the last 5 years as this approaches $500 million in lodging sales in rural Idaho. I think it's very interesting that you see a pretty strong uptick in 2020, which is the pandemic year, right? So another way to think about this is that during the pandemic, people were foregoing large vacations, right? We know that airline travel was throttled, hospitality kind of across the country really suffered. You certainly see this if you look at the employment statistics in Nevada, for example, major tourism hotspot. 2020 was not a good year for them, but you did see a strong uptick in rural lodging sales in Idaho. And so what this suggests is that in recent years, particularly through the pandemic, people were foregoing major vacations abroad or across the rest of the country, and instead they were favoring enjoying and sampling the natural beauty of Idaho, staying close to home, spending more of those lodging dollars in the state. And so you just see this really nice uptick in rural visits, and that's manifested in the lodging sales. So the beauty of rural Idaho is certainly manifesting itself here with more and more lodging stays in our rural counties as people go out to enjoy our beautiful state. So on that idyllic note, I think we will transition to the Q&A, and I think you can drop those in the chat and we will answer them as they come in. We have about 10 minutes for that, so we should be able to get to your questions. And I am not at present seeing any.
While we're waiting for questions, Sam, do you mind? I'm going to ask a question of Brandon real quick. So Brandon, in your ag section, I was really shocked, and I think probably some people that are on this webinar too, were how much revenue comes from urban agriculture in Idaho. Were you surprised by that, by urban's influence as well?
No, I'm not surprised at all. I think when people think of urban, they think of, sprawling cityscapes. But if we're talking about on the county level, I know from my region specifically, you get out of that urban region in that county, even though it's an urban county, Bannock County, City Pocatello. Right outside the city of Pocatello, you've got farmland. I had a relative visit from Boston, and she's like coming into Pocatello Airport, and she talks to me about what are those little circles that I see coming over the plain? Oh, those are the fields. That's the crops. So no, absolutely. It makes perfect sense that urban would be a major component of Idaho farm revenue. But like I said, a lot of that is just up to land competition when it comes to maybe some small reductions in that over the past 20 years.
I've got a couple of questions that have come in, and they're both for Brandon. So the first is about the definition of agricultural acreage. They're asking if it means irrigated acreage or if it includes rangeland, grazing, and things like that.
I'm not entirely sure if it includes just irrigated or rangeland, but it would include, I would think maybe both, but I'm just not sure.
It includes everything. This data is from the U.S. Census of Agriculture. The most recent one was 2022. They do it on a 5-year scale. It looks at irrigated, non-irrigated, pasture, livestock area. It's anywhere that's considered part of a farm, whether that's animals or crops, that is included in these numbers.
And I'm pretty sure the definition of a farm is linked to revenue generation, correct? Anything that generates revenue.
Commercial activity.
The next question for Brandon is whether the recent decline in work from home hours is expected to continue, or whether that's just sort of a one-off, perhaps, from the executive orders reducing work from home for federal employees.
Right. I think it's pretty hard to say. I don't have a crystal ball on what's going to happen as far as work from home goes. I see a lot of like headlines that talk about there's a huge shift in culture as far as work from home goes, but there was a shift also in 2023. And in the big picture, we didn't see a big overall reduction, and it stayed pretty flat after that. So it could be the case that it decreases to an extent, but then it stays a little bit elevated from pre-pandemic. But it's just going to be, time will tell, right?
We also have another question. If construction is bundled with manufacturing, those are separate industries in the two-digit NAICS system. They will be together when you see the label goods producing. They're both goods producing industries, so they're both in there. But when you see the label just manufacturing, there's no building construction included in that. We also have a question about short-term rental tax collection. That would be part of the increase in lodging stays. Yes, if there's a new form of collection, the sort of underlying basis of the data is shifting over time, and we understand that vacations look very different than they did 20 years ago. So there is a sort of shifting data collection base there in terms of what is a lodging stay. So that's a good point as well. And then I'm not seeing any other questions. We do have one note from our resident agricultural expert, Jan Rozier, who notes that federally leased grazing acres are not included in farm acres. But if it's obviously a privately owned rangeland, that would be different. And then I'm not seeing any other questions in here. Does anyone have one more question or a parting thought from my fellow panelists?
I was just going to say that again, I'm going to say that even though when you look at some of the financial numbers of rural, it doesn't seem as huge when you look at some of the other things that rural provides, as far as the recreation opportunities, the lifestyle, the farmland. There's so many of Idaho's amazing natural resource, 3,100 miles of navigable whitewater, right? I mean, there's things that really can't be measured financially that are so integral to rural and are probably a huge draw as to why people are choosing to live there and remain there. And I think it's hard to measure, but it's something that I do want to make sure and drive home that it is incredibly important to Idaho, and that rural will always be an incredible part of we're a rural state, and so it's a big part of what defines us.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, I showed you that graph earlier. The population has grown pretty significantly across rural Idaho. The aggregate rural population has grown considerably, and although we tend to think of the growth in the urban counties, rural Idaho is growing as well. And the fact that it's growing is definitely proof that these are places that are desirable for people to live, because there are places that are shrinking, that are less desirable in this country. And so population growth is sort of concrete proof that there is a lot being offered by these communities, and they're very desirable to people. And with that, I think we will hand it off to Will to close us out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, not only to our panelists for that presentation there, but would like to thank all of you who attended today. The complete rural profile will be available later this year. You can view part 1 of the profile from earlier this spring right now on the Idaho Department of Labor YouTube channel. Our next webinar, Tuesday, July 22nd. Sam Wolkenhauer will be discussing state demographics and population projections. To register for that webinar and for others, please navigate the Idaho Department of Labor calendar of events. And for more information, you can just go to labor.idaho.gov. We would also like to remind you that the Idaho Department of Labor has many services geared to job seekers and employers, but also includes free access to labor market information at lmi.idaho.gov. Thank you so much for all of your time. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you back here on July 22nd.